Mic is on. Great. Welcome everyone to the Friday seminar. My name is Aaron Golub, and I'll be introducing and moderating today's seminar. Our Friday seminars have been a tradition since the year 2000. These seminars are once again being held live here at Portland State University's urban campus, located on the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlawa bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations here of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge that we are here because of the sacrifices forced on the indigenous ancestors of this place. Remember these communities and honor their legacy, lives, and descendants. Today, we are pleased to have Deborah Salon present on how COVID-19 changed our cities, evidence from a multi-wave national survey. Deborah studies transportation in cities with the goal of better understanding of how these systems work and how policies and smart investments might improve them. She's passionate about doing research that can help solve real-world problems, and a common thread in her work is to inform policies that aim to reduce global automobile dependence. Salon employs methods ranging from qualitative interview-based research to advanced econometric analysis. She holds a PhD in agriculture and resource economics from UC Davis. Before joining the faculty at ASU, Arizona State University, Salon completed a postdoctoral fellowship at Columbia University's Earth Institute and subsequently held a research appointment at UC Davis's Institute for Transportation Studies. And we've been working together for 23 years, so it's great to have you here. Here's a preview of some of the remaining speakers in our fall series. And I'd like to take this opportunity to let you know about another upcoming event on Monday, this coming Monday. Jennifer Dill, the director of our center here, will be moderating a panel discussion on the future of transportation in downtown Portland, inspirations from the 1972 downtown plan. This event is part of a series offered by PSU's College of Urban and Public Affairs, centering around the theme of PSU as an urban university. You can find a link to RSVP to this panel on TREC's upcoming events webpage, as well as a link to College of Urban and Public Affairs website about the series, where you can find the schedule and more information about the full series. Also, I'd like to note next Friday morning, not part of the normal seminar, Friday Transportation Seminar series, but additional to, is a workshop on research into comics led by Dr. Kelly Clifton. And you can see the link here to attend, and you can also find that link at our event site at the TREC website. And so that's an additional and new event. And so for today's seminar, you can expect our speaker to speak for about 40 minutes, followed by Q&A. You'll be receiving questions through the Q&A feature on your control panel for the webinars, for the webinar attendees, and we'll ask them at the end, we will ask them for you at the end of the presentation. If we run out of time for all the questions, we will give our speaker the opportunity to email written responses for any questions left unanswered. We have enabled closed captioning, but you must click on the CC feature on your control panel to view them. We will also be recording today's webinar. It will be available on our website later today, along with the slides. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. With that, I'm going to switch the slide deck and hand it over to Deborah.
Awesome. So while Aaron's finding my slides, I'll just say it's great to be here. Thanks for inviting me. It's awesome to be in the rain here in Portland because, you know, in Arizona, actually, we've had a lot of rain recently, to be honest. Like last weekend, we had a whole bunch of rain, but it's really fun to be up here. So thanks again. And it's awesome to see my old friend, Aaron. So today I am going to be sharing with you some kind of the final culmination, I feel like, of the work that I have been doing together with collaborators, both at Arizona State University, where I am, and also at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Since very early, like basically when the pandemic when COVID-19 first started, we were a group of researchers at these two universities that were doing survey-based research on how, travel behavior, and we were implementing surveys. And at that time, we kind of all got together and decided, well, this seems like an opportunity to start asking people what they're doing differently with this new reality where there was a pandemic that was really restricting how movement of people and travel in their daily lives and what was going on. And also to ask how they, over time, kind of how did they expect the future, if at all, to be different from what their lives were like before the pandemic. And so today I'll talk more about the details of the survey that we implemented, or set of surveys. We implemented 3 over the course of a year and a bit. And so today I feel like I can tell you kind of the full story of what did we learn about what changed and what didn't, and what does that mean going forward. So as I just said, COVID-19 required most of us to make really big changes to our daily lives, and especially related to transportation and mobility, just because we were afraid to move around and meet up with other people and get infected, right, or infect others. And so a lot of us switched from commuting every day to workplaces or to school, to working or studying from home. A lot of us switched from shopping in stores to actually ordering our even groceries, but other goods as well, online, and having them delivered, so we didn't have to interact with people. Instead of flying to meet people, we moved to video conferencing, as I know most of the people watching today are doing. So the big question that our research was asking is which of these behaviors, and other ones too, might kind of stick long term. Which of these things, if any, are going to be sticky? And early on in the pandemic, it was interesting. People have been writing about this in the public, in the mainstream media the entire time. People say, but most of what you read in the media is just people looking around and seeing what's going on and writing what they think. There's a few other, real data collection efforts that have happened, but I think not very many. And ours is one that I'm quite proud of and happy to share what we've learned from, I think, not just what we think is going to happen or what we theorize might have happened or what we theorize now did happen, but actually based on a pretty large sample of what people said was happening and what they were going to do. So which things stick? Another big question is for whom and where? Is there a difference in terms of the stickiness of some of these behaviors between people and places? And so, like I said, our national survey data shed some light on these questions. So I'll be sharing with you today. Big question: how has COVID-19 changed our cities? So the survey that we implemented, we called it the COVID Future Survey, or set of surveys. We do have a website. I have to admit, we haven't updated the website in a little while, but if you want to go to our website, the one good reason to go to our website actually is to download our data. We've made our data fully public. It's at covidfuture.org, and you can go there, and there should be pretty easy to find the download data link, and then that'll take you to another website where you download the data. But yeah, the data are fully cleaned and publicly available for others to use. I just want to emphasize this is not work that I did by myself. It was a pretty large research team, and this doesn't even account for all of the people who were involved. There's a few that are missing, but just to give you an idea, it's a pretty big research team, pretty big effort. So what did the survey look like? So like I said, we were transportation researchers, but we did ask about some behaviors that maybe aren't typical for transportation researchers. So, but we asked about employment, like whether people were employed, and about how they, where they were employed and where they went, or where they went to school, working and studying. and sort of about their commuting. We asked about shopping and dining. So we thought those were other behaviors that were changing quite a bit during that pandemic period. We asked about daily transportation. It wasn't, I mean, you guys may have maybe used to hearing about travel diary style research. This was not a full travel diary. This was sort of like habitual, you know, how often do you make trips and by which modes and things like that. So it wasn't like a full-on travel diary, but you got some idea of their sort of transportation daily habits beyond just the commute trips. We asked about their attitudes towards a whole bunch of different things. And then we have a demographic section. The survey took people depending on who they work. So there's a lot of skip logic in the survey. If you're survey designers, you know what that means, right? So if you were, for instance, if you're retired, you skipped all the questions about working and commuting, whatever. So some people took, it was quite not very long survey, maybe 15 minutes. And for some people, it took as long as 30 minutes if they had to fill out all the sections. Wave one of the survey was collected really starting in June 2020. We have a few people who did the survey earlier than that, but those responses were more of what we call a convenience sample. So kind of not representative of the general population. Starting in June 2020, we collected our more representative sample. And it really, we left wave one open for a really long time, but most of the data was collected between June 2020 and October 2020, which is still a pretty long period. And the sample size was about 9,000 respondents, 9,000 adults across the United States answered wave one. And like I said, this is a panel survey. So what that means is that in wave two and wave three, we only invited people who answered wave one. So it's not what we call a repeated cross-section. This is a true panel. So we have the same respondents in each wave. So wave two, but of course, not everyone decided to come back and answer our second and third survey. So wave two was implemented, again, a pretty long period of time. We started wave two right after the main part of wave one ended in October 2020. So we started in November 2020. And it went all the way through to about April 2021, or maybe even slightly later than that. The sample size was about 3,000 people. So about a 30% of the initial sample answered wave two, and kind of the same for wave three. In terms of sample size, about a third of the initial respondents answered wave three. And we implemented that in a much shorter period of time, just October and November 2021. So that's our final data set. So it's still, at this point, it's a year old. So we're talking about data from 1 year ago. And I guess I'll say one more thing about kind of the structure of the surveys. We did, for wave two and wave three, we invited everyone from wave one to answer. Even for wave three, like even if they didn't answer wave two, we invited them again for wave three if they answered wave one, unless they told us, never send us an email again, and then we took them off the list. But there weren't that many people who said that. But so there's today I'm going to be really talking about the results from wave one and wave three, and I'm kind of skipping over wave two, mostly because what we found was that people in wave two, their answers were sort of somewhere in between. So what's interesting is really one and three, and not so much two. So you'll see. So like I said, this was a national survey. This is the spatial distribution of our wave one respondents, more or less. And you can see that mostly it's representative of where we have a lot of people living in the United States. So you can see like the very populous states like Texas and California and Florida, New York, Ohio, Illinois. These states have quite a lot of respondents. The one state that obviously sticks out as having too many respondents is Arizona, or too many for the population of the state. And that's just because of some of the structure of the sample. And if people want to talk about exactly how we implemented survey and how we had multiple different sort of modes of inviting people to take the survey, and different companies that helped us out and different things. And because of that, we ended up with some extra samples in Arizona. But other than that, it's more or less representative. And to deal with that, we did a weighting exercise, and not just that, but to deal with regional, any regional kind of variation from the actual distribution of the population, and also to adjust for any deviation between our sample and the actual, census-based population statistics on these variables. So age, gender, education level, which is like whether they had a bachelor's degree or not, Hispanic status, vehicle ownership, income category, and whether the household had children. So what this ends up meaning, just for those of you interested in survey implementation, is that all those observations in Arizona end up having pretty low weights. So like each person who answered the survey in Arizona, their response counts as like a fifth of a response as from someone who was sort of from a more representative subpopulation. So okay, so what did we find? So I'll start out by saying, by communicating. So we'll start out with like what returned, or what has returned or will return to the pre-COVID norm. And then I'll talk about what I think has changed, and which maybe is more interesting. But I think both of them are actually quite interesting. What has gone back is interesting too. So one thing that we noticed a huge drop in, and this is not so much, I guess, for like urban travel, this is intercity travels, air travel. One thing we obviously noticed a huge drop in is air travel just like plummeted. Nobody was traveling on airplanes for the pandemic period. I mean, not nobody, but it went way down. So you can see the blue bar is the people who never were traveling on an airplane. And this COVID actual is people's responses in our wave 3 survey to how many times did they get on an airplane in the last year. So that was from fall 2020 to fall 2021 is how many times did they get on an airplane. So that wasn't even like peak pandemic, but even then you can see that most people were not getting on airplanes. But you can also see that when we ask people, well, what do you expect in terms of your leisure airplane travel for the post-pandemic period? And I say another thing, I should backtrack a little. Another thing I should explain is when we asked people their expectations for the future, there's a lot of different ways you can think about doing that, right? Because the future is, a long period of time. Do you identify a particular future date that you're asking about, or do you identify a future like state of the world that you're asking about, or do you just make it open? What do you think for the future? And what we decided to do on our surveys was we specified the future state of the world was when you are no longer concerned about COVID-19, the threat of COVID-19 has lessened to the point where you're, going about your life the way you would if you were not feeling threatened by this disease, right? I think it was like when the threat of COVID-19 has passed. It wasn't quite like that. I'm trying to think of it'll come back to me if you're interested in the exact wording, but that was how we identified the future and expectations for the future. So for I'm going to be showing you many charts that look just like this, that are basically just summary statistics from our data, but carefully curated summary statistics from the data that try to tell a story about what we think has changed. And so every time in every one of these graphs that look basically like this, you'll see the pre-COVID actual, which is what's collected on that wave 1 survey. There was a whole section that asked about what did you do before the pandemic, and at that point we thought that the responses would be pretty good because it hadn't been that long, since people had been living pre-pandemic. And then the COVID actual is what was happening, either at the time of the survey, or in this particular case, and for air travel, we asked them what did they do in the last year on that fall 2021 survey. And then the post-COVID expected is what do you expect will be your habit or your behavior once the threat of COVID-19 has passed. So that's how we organized our data. And we see that if anything, air travel expectations for the future for leisure are even up a little bit compared to the pre-COVID actual. That's something we've actually seen, right? Then this data is from fall 2021, but we've seen it in real time too, right? This past summer, airports were totally full, flights were full, things were crazy. And I don't know if this is what people are going to keep doing long term, or if this is sort of a rebound effect, right? From not being able to travel here, sort of foregoing a bunch of trips and then wanting to travel a bunch more. So not sure if it's a rebound effect or if actually we're going to be traveling more going forward, but for sure, this dip was temporary. So if we think about business air travel, we see the same thing, except there isn't a rebound effect. It's like you go right back to the way it was. And this was a little surprising to us, right? We thought that, I thought anyway, that we would find more of a permanent dip in business air travel because there's so much video conferencing going on that you would think that some of those air trips would be converted to video conferences for meetings or, whatever business people were doing. Well, it turns out, at least based on our survey data and probably based on, if the airlines did their own survey, I bet they would find the same thing, that it seems to have come right back. And that maybe there weren't a lot of business trips pre-COVID that were, as effective online as maybe it seemed like there would have been. So this is an interesting chart and maybe a little bit surprising. Another thing that hasn't changed is people's walking habits. So this slide and the next one maybe are like kind of no-brainers. Yeah, like why would people's walking, and the next one is a biking. Why would people's walking and biking habits change? Well, I mean, there was all this enthusiasm for walking and biking during the pandemic, right? And there were all these movements toward more like slow streets and people and there was this run on bicycles at some point and couldn't get a bike, there's so much. And so, and actually if we just looked at our wave 1 survey data, people responded that way. Like they responded to our survey saying that they were more enthusiastic about walking and biking. But then once we got to wave 3, not so much. It's about the same. And you can see on the biking as well, it's the same. Despite the popularity of slow streets, bicycling habits do not seem to have changed. So those are the things that haven't changed that we asked about. I worked with one of my PhD students for a very long time trying to answer this question, because this is another thing that's been in the news a lot, right? Thinking about how has the pandemic differentially affected different groups? Is it worse for, I don't know, is it worse in different, racial, different racial groups, that they experience the pandemic differently? And they did in a health kind of scenario. I know that. We were looking at economically. Men and women, did they experience the pandemic differently? Did they, and not only did they experience it differently, but has it, regardless of that, sort of, was that experience temporary? Or, have they been able to bounce back? What is sort of the long-term implications? So, so the question is, did the pandemic make already disadvantaged groups worse off for the long term? We spent so long last year trying to analyze our data to try to figure out the answer to this question. And I'll show you what we found. I mean, basically, not really, at least based on our data, with the possible exception of women's income. So I'm not going to show you lots of charts. This is the only table I'll show you, because basically the answer is it's not bad news. So basically, we looked at household income, we looked at whether people were employed, and we looked at income security. And this income security was a question on the survey that was about, it was taken from I think a survey that is I forget which one, but it's one of the main survey that's implemented by the US government. That's about like, if you had a sort of a surprise $400 expense, would you be able to pay it? And there's a bunch of different possible answers, but essentially that's the way we measured income security. If people said, yes, I'd be able to pay it, then we called them income secure. If they said, I'm not sure, or no, I would not be able to pay it, then we called them income insecure. Anyway, so interesting little note on income security. It turns out men respond with very much higher income security than women. And I think it's just like a confidence thing, right? Because I don't think the actual income levels are that different. This is household income, right? So it's kind of funny to see that really, really large difference between genders in how they respond to this income security question. But in any event, so what we found is for household income and employment, essentially, like overall, if we looked at pre-pandemic to wave 3 employment, income, and income security questions, we found that they were stable or income security actually increased. And this makes a bit of sense. We were still in that period at the time that we did the survey, and multiple times during the COVID pandemic period, when people received a bunch of money from the government. And so especially for people who maybe were income insecure, that money might have made them more income secure, which is something that we've also seen in the national media and came out a bit in our survey, that we've had this increase in income security. There was a definite decrease in employment during the pandemic, but it mostly came back. And so then we looked at for women. So if we just look at women, we see a slight decrease in household income. And so this is comparing what they reported on the survey, the initial survey as their 2019 income, and what they reported as their 2020 income on our 2021 survey. Slight decrease. But a slight increase in employment and increase in income security. For Black respondents to the survey, we see household income was increasing from pre-pandemic to 2020. Their employment was increasing and their income security was increasing. For Hispanic populations, we found that their income was stable, their employment was stable, and their income security had an even larger increase than for the other groups. So this is generally good news, right? The pandemic we did find, though, also for all of these marginalized groups, they're doing worse than the less marginalized groups. So women are doing worse than men, Black and Hispanic respondents are doing worse than Asian and white respondents. So, all sort of the general patterns of advantage and disadvantage in society are reproduced in our data. But if we talk about like relative from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, it hasn't like made things worse, is what we're finding. All right, so now to probably the question that you're perhaps most interested in, which changes are here to stay? And I have a few to share with you. So this is probably the least large change, but it's an interesting one that I think people in the restaurant industry care about a lot. Dining in restaurants. Our data show, a bit surprisingly, a persistent 20% drop in restaurant dining in the restaurant. And it does not show a compensating increase in takeout or delivery for restaurant food. So we see no basic change in takeout and delivery patterns, but this drop in in-person dining. And this means almost nothing for transportation. It's like one trip to a restaurant per month or something like that, approximately. So this is not much of a transportation outcome that people are going to care about, but it means quite a bit if you're like in the restaurant industry, right? If you're owning and operating a restaurant, or if you're working as a server in a restaurant, there are fewer jobs for you, less money for you, less business. So this is a big deal for this one industry, probably not a big deal for the transportation system. Same idea in grocery delivery, right? Like there's a big increase. If you're in the grocery delivery business, you've seen your business double, more than double during the pandemic, but even like post-COVID expected levels are double the pre-COVID levels, right? For the regular grocery delivery customers. But still, it's just not that big a deal probably for transportation, right? It's just 10% of people getting some delivery. And then even regularly is still maybe like once a month or, something like that. It's not every day, all the time. So this is not going to add a ton more trips into our streets or anything like that. But it's a big deal if you're in the grocery delivery business. So this is obviously the big one, right? Working from home. So I'm going to show you a couple slides on working from home. If you want to know like everything we know about working from home, I actually just published a big paper on working from home from our data. Happy to share that with people. But so this was from the W1 here is wave one. Our wave one data forecast a large sticky increase in remote work, where we went from 23% of workers working from home at least a few times a month to 43% during the previous week when they took the survey in wave one. And then they expected not much of a decrease to 40% saying that they were going to continue to work from home post-COVID. And to just emphasize, this is not just I want to, or I wish I could, or it's, it's not a desire to work from home. This is an expectation, right? So the survey had a set of questions that sort of led to this. It's not just one question, do you want to work from home or do you, whatever. There was a question, do you expect to have the option to work from home? And they had to answer yes or no to that one. And only if they answered yes, did they get the question, well, do you expect to actually do it and how often, kind of thing. So we really tried to lead our respondents through a thought process where they were thinking about, okay, is my employer going to let me? And then what am I going to do? Rather than just, what am I going to do if I get to choose? Right. So a lot of people have looked at our data and thought, well, that's just what people are saying, especially early on when we present this, they didn't believe it. Now I think it's maybe common knowledge. We're getting a lot more working from home. But when we first presented this stuff, back in mid 2020, people are like, oh, people don't know what they want, or people don't know what they're going to. I said, I don't know. I trust my respondents a little more than that. All right. So wave 3 was even stronger. So in wave 3, we have an even larger sticky increase in remote work. So this is a little weird because this COVID actual is just the question is in the last week. So in the last week, only 37% of the respondents had actually worked from home. But when we asked them if they worked from home at all during the pandemic, I forget them. It was like 90%. It's like most people had worked from home during the pandemic. But here we see the post-COVID expected percent of people that are going to be working from home regularly is nearly 50%. It's a really big number. And this obviously has a really big impact on the transportation system. And some more like kind of amazing statistics about working from home. I find this one, you do a survey and you ask people questions, you never get 95% of people saying something. That just never, ever, ever happens. So we were asking, so you have to subset the data to get this 95%, but the subset is interesting. So it's nearly everyone who was new to remote. So the people who had not worked from home pre-pandemic, so the new work from homers, and they said they expected that their employer was going to let them continue. Of those people, 95% are going to do it. So this is a popular choice. People like working from home, maybe not every day all the time, but this is like very popular thing. At least sometimes, and at least sometimes meaning like, regularly, at least a few times a month, a few times a week. I think it was like I think the next slide says, of these folks, about a quarter of them plan to continue to work from home full time. They're not going to the office hardly at all. This is like huge shift for these people. And again, for the transportation system. And it's not that many people. The new telecommuters who can continue, it's like 10% of the workforce, at least in our data set. So it's not, but this is still a big change. So when you look at that, so then we looked at in our data, we collected information about people's pre-COVID commuting patterns. And so we see here is that so the question here is, well, how does work from home affect car commuting? And so it's kind of interesting. Oops. What you see here is that it doesn't affect so what I did is I put like all of the car commuting in purple and then not car commuting in green. So but there's different shades of purple, and the different shades of purple are how often you're actually car commuting. So the dark purple is I'm always car commuting. The lighter purple is like the medium purple is like I'm car commuting most days. The lighter purple is sometimes. And these most days and some days, these are the people who are working from home the other days, right? So they're not commuting every day. So so we see here that even the car commuters pre-COVID, some of them didn't car commute every day, but nearly 70% of all the workers did car commute every day. And post-COVID, that's down to 55%, something like that. So that's a pretty big difference. It's not a big difference if you ask people like, so this is going to be a tricky thing for travel surveys going forward, because, and you got to be careful if you're doing a travel survey, because if you just ask people, what mode do you use to commute? They'll think, well, when I commute, I use a car. That hasn't changed. But it's the frequency of how often they commute that has changed. And that will change, that has changed commuting patterns. And so we did the same thing with transit, and transit is a little hard to tell, right? Because most people don't commute by transit in the US. So it's a little hard to tell, but it turns out that there's an even larger percent decrease in transit commuting, and I'll blow this up in the next slide so you can see. So if you look here, the axis over here is just up to 10%. So it's just the bottom 10% of that chart. But you can see again, so now we've got the dark green is I always take transit. I mostly take transit. I sometimes take transit. These are the sometimes work from homers. And post-COVID, people are expecting, many fewer of them are expecting to always take transit. There's a lot more telecommuters. So it turns out that the transit riding, the pre-COVID transit riding population is actually even more likely than the average commuter to be working from home. So it's like to be adopting work from home. So, you know, those numbers I showed you about how many people are working from home earlier, it's even higher among transit commuters. So it's hitting the transit agencies even harder than, you know, than it's changing other modes. And so this is, you know, this kind of shift we've actually looked in the census data, and it's coming out in the census. I don't know if any of you have looked at transit ridership, or not transit ridership, but transit, like the journey to work questions in the census that ask about commute mode. Well, one of them is about transit, obviously, and that's now evident in the census data as well, that it's about half of the pre-COVID numbers. So, so if you do some math with our data, you end up with that equating to about a 15% reduction in car commute, vehicle miles traveled, all of which comes from more telecommuting, and a 40% projected drop in transit commute trips per week, half from telecommute increases and half from mode switching. So this is a big deal for our transit agencies. So just kind of to sum up, and I know I'm getting near the end here. So how did COVID-19 change our cities? Oops. Yeah, there we go. Mostly it didn't, I think is the answer. But there are really big increases in working from home and big decreases in transit demand. And I guess I've written a little about this. I think these are areas where we could collectively really do some deep thinking and think about innovation and how to make remote work or hybrid schedules or whatever work, and office spaces reconfigured and reimagined to work in our new world that is different from what it used to be. And transit agencies similarly, like how can we reconfigure transit so it still serves, the commuters that still want to use it, but reconfigured to serve the rest of the people that are trying to, that are now making up a higher fraction of the total public transportation demand. So that's the end of what I had to say. As I mentioned, we have our data available for download and links to most of our publications. I need to update the website at covidfuture.org. Feel free to download the data and do whatever you like with it. And thanks so much for listening today. I'm open for questions if anyone has any. Yeah. Do you want me to give you all that?
So for a lot of the comparisons, it is okay. It is looking at the whole sample instead of how individual behavior changes. So I was actually wondering, for example, the air travel one, maybe the overall ratio of different categories didn't change, but maybe people are moving from categories to categories. Is there any results like that?
Yeah, I didn't show you oh, sorry. sorry. Yeah, I didn't include them in the presentation, but and they're just such a pain to make. But for all of these things, we have these, what they call Sankey plots, that are like these graphics that show how people are moving from different categories to other categories. I'm not sure we made one for the air travel recently for this recent version. But just looking at well, yeah, I haven't made one for that actually. Yeah. So I don't know exactly how people are shifting between the categories. Yeah, for work from home, I have those. And I actually took it out of this presentation because it's hard to see. But yeah, but for work from home, it's interesting. I mean, it's mostly what you'd expect, right? So the people who never had the option to work from home moved to a combination of working in person during the pandemic and also being unemployed. Most of the people who lost their jobs during the pandemic actually were people who didn't have the option to work from home. And then those people went right back into working in person, not working from home after. But there's a subset of people who moved from, about half of the people. I mean, and it's got to be that true given these summary statistics, but about half of the regular future telecommuters are people who previously were not regular telecommuters, right? So there's a lot of, that has to be true if you've got these percentages changing. Yeah. It's in my paper though, too. We have the Sankey plot.
I may have missed this, but just wondering, do you have plans to keep collecting data in the future?
Nope, no more funding. No, we don't have any more money for this project. And also, people ask this a lot. And at one point we're like, oh, we should get more money and see if we can get more money to keep this going. But then we thought, I think it's not going to change. I mean, people's answers have been remarkably, about their expectations for the future have been mostly incredibly stable across the waves of the survey. And so we're like, well, we could keep asking them, but they'll just keep telling us the same thing. And I don't really know how much we're going to learn. So I think we just didn't think it was a valuable use of our time or a valuable use of a funder's money to spend more effort doing this. Question?
So on the business travel, I'm just wondering if there had already been a decline in business travel before your pre-COVID data point, maybe in the previous decade. I don't know if you had looked at that. Okay.
And we do have a couple of online questions. And so starting at the top, somebody is wondering how to understand the decrease in car commute, how to understand the decrease in car commuting, meshing with indications in many metro areas that congestion is back to or exceeding pre-COVID levels.
Yep. Okay. So I had a little note on the bottom of that slide. We're going to go back to it. Yeah. So this little note at the bottom, latent demand is already filling up the road. So this is sort of congestion theory 101 example is, anytime you have a place that's a popular place, a congested road, then if it becomes less congested and it becomes, easier to travel on that road at a peak hour, then people who previously had been avoiding it, they would find it convenient to travel at that time too. So they'll just fill up the road. So I think that's one answer. And then another answer is that I don't know exactly. I don't know if we know yet what all those trips are for or exactly what the deal is, but there is a whole host of research for, predating the pandemic on telecommuting and on how telecommuting affects travel. And basically the upshot of all that research is that telecommuting, a bit surprisingly, doesn't affect travel all that much, that people, for a variety of reasons. I mean, if people are, people still have to go out and do other things, like they still have to go do their shopping, or they go to see their friend, or they go to pick up their kid. And a lot of people, I think, if they're commuting, they fit some of those other trips into their commute trip. And so when they're not commuting, they still have to make those other trips. And so it ends up being almost as much travel. So I guess there's two questions. There's a question about total travel, and then there's a question about peak hour travel. And I think that my understanding, and one of my collaborators is actually currently doing research on this exact topic. And if I recall, he told me that peak hour travel actually still is down, but overall travel is back. And I think it's because of this effect that telecommuting, that's an old result, that telecommuting doesn't actually impact overall vehicle travel very much. Yeah.
And one more online question. Does the research compare outcomes among different groups with different income levels?
Yes, but I didn't put those findings into this presentation. I mean, or at least we can, or we have. Yeah, when you have this kind of data set, you can look at it so many different ways. So yeah, but I would have to go back and look at the data myself and just do some new calculations to tell you exactly what the findings are. What I'm imagining your question is asking is, like, I showed you those comparisons of, whether income, income impacts and employment impacts, and whether those are different for different income groups, whether sort of low income people were hit harder than higher income people. I think the answer is probably, yes, during the pandemic, some extent, although the government support programs helped low income people a lot also, was what I remember from our earlier analysis, but I haven't redone it with the wave 3 data. Something else I'll comment on that I didn't put in the presentation, but is another kind of conversation that people have when they think about telecommuting, and I think is a really important research question right now that we don't know the answer to, which is how does telecommuting affect where people live? And so is the fact that telecommuting has gone way up, is that going to make people decide they're going to move either to, totally far-flung locations? Like I mean, you probably personally, individually have decided to do this. I have a former neighbor who decided to move to Montana because he's like, well, I'm working from home anyway. I like fly fishing. Like, oh, good. But yeah, so there's that kind of movement, and there's been some news reports about, various rural resort towns getting to be, this influx of telecommuters from all over the place. And then there's also this concern that even if they're not moving to these very far-flung resort towns, that they'll move sort of out to more exurban locations within the metropolitan areas that they live in, causing, more transportation when they do travel to their office or when they travel to anything, because they're just farther away from any destinations they would like to go to. And I think the answer is we looked in our data, because we did ask about moving, and we looked in our data to see if we could find any evidence that this was happening, and we did not find any evidence that this was happening. But also, I think it's early days. So this is one thing where, like, moving takes a long time to happen. I can say pretty confidently that by fall 2021, there wasn't like a mass exodus from the denser parts of our cities based on our data, but I don't know what the future is going to bring on that. And I think that is something that planners, transportation planners, land use planners, should be just keeping an eye on and trying to think about. And if you're in the business of doing research and you can think of a way to try to answer that research question and try to figure out, like, is more telecommuting really getting people, kind of causing people to move farther away from activity centers? That would be really nice to know the answer to, because I think there have been some attempts in the literature, and I think all of them have not been successful in my evaluation anyway.
So there's another time dimension in your data that is age. If you look at cohorts, did you look at any kind of cohort effects where maybe your younger respondents were, say, more interested in food delivery or more interested in telecommuting than the older cohorts, which could mean that actually your numbers are underestimating long-term changes, if that makes sense?
That's a great question. And I don't know the answer. I would need to look. I think I'm trying to remember what I just did this big analysis on the telecommuting piece of this. And I think their age mattered some, but less than sort of the really important variables of what industry you work in, and what your education level were kind of the two really big things that mattered for whether you were going to be telecommuting. Age mattered a little bit, but not as much as those kind of key big variables, like what are you doing for work? Yeah. So I don't know, but it could definitely be that. I don't know. I need to look in the data to find out about, like, restaurant patronage and grocery delivery and all this. Yeah.
And then I think I'm going to combine these two online questions because they're kind of related to one another. Is it safe to say that with the increase in people working from home and the decrease in transit demand, that this means that there's an induced demand shifting people away from transit and into their car travel instead? And then somebody else is wondering, and what do you think the ramifications are of forced returns to the office? Like, what might happen then?
So I'm going to talk about the second one first, and then I might have to ask what the first one was again. But the second one, I've done a good bit of thinking about forced returns to the office. I basically think it's a terrible idea. I think what will happen is that when you force people to come back to the office, a lot of them will quit and find new jobs. And I mean, we've seen that. That is what has happened. And a lot of employers that have tried to force a return to the office have seen mass resignations and needed to change their policies. And I think, I didn't talk about it here, but we in our survey and in other surveys too, we asked not just about working from home and whether people plan to do it more, but we also asked about, or into the future, we also asked about productivity while working from home and how their productivity changed during the pandemic more generally. And what we found, and it's consistent with lots of other research on telecommuting, is that it doesn't really change productivity very much, especially if it is sort of a hybrid schedule where you are sometimes interacting in person with people. If anything, it actually increases productivity. And so, yeah, I would caution employers against forcing everybody back full time. And that's why I wrote in the slide that I think there needs to be some innovation and some rethinking of how we think about workplaces and remote work, and how to find the right mix for different companies and for different types of jobs. Because I think it's got to be different going forward. I think trying to go back to how it used to be is going to be counterproductive. So what was the other question?
It was wondering if the switch to more telecommuting and decrease in transit is basically because those folks are in their cars now on the days that they are coming into the office.
Partially. So I actually have, let's see. So I actually calculated, does this answer the question? I mean, I actually calculated how much of this projected drop in transit commute trips per week was from telecommute increases versus from mode switching. It's about half and half. So it's about, so 20% projected drop from telecommuting increases and another 20% drop from people switching to cars. So yes, it's both, but we actually calculated the proportion.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.